The notification that shattered everything I thought I knew about family arrived at 11:34 on a Thursday night in March, delivered through the glowing screen of my phone while I sat cross-legged on my bed in my cramped Austin apartment, half watching a true crime documentary I'd seen 3 times before. The message came via Instagram DM from someone I barely knew. My stepmother's younger sister, Vanessa, a woman I'd met exactly twice at awkward family gatherings, where I'd felt like an outsider in my own father's home, someone who'd never had reason to contact me before, in the 3 years since she'd become peripherally attached to my life through marriage. The message was short, just 7 words that made absolutely no sense in the moment, but would come to define one of the most devastating periods of my existence. You need to check your email immediately. My name is Meredith Ann Beck, though most people call me Mir. I'm 26 years old, living in Austin, Texas, sharing a 1-bedroom apartment with my best friend from college, in a building where the air conditioning barely works, and the neighbors above us seem to move furniture at 2 in the morning every single night. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone wears jeans and brings their dogs to work, and the coffee is good, but the pay is mediocre. After rent, student loans, car insurance, and groceries, I usually have about $50 left each month for what my meticulously maintained budget spreadsheet optimistically labels entertainment and savings, though it almost always gets spent on emergency vet visits for my cat, or unexpected car repairs, or the occasional dinner out with friends when I can't stand another night of meal-prepped chicken and rice. It was late on a Thursday, past 11:30, later than I usually stayed up on work nights, and I'd been working on a freelance logo design project to make extra money, trying to pad that anemic entertainment fund, my laptop balanced on my knees, while I half-watched the documentary about a cold case from the 1980s that I'd seen so many times I could recite the narrator's lines. The Instagram notification made my stomach drop immediately in that visceral way it does when you somehow know something's wrong before your conscious mind has processed any actual information, when your body understands threat before your brain catches up. Vanessa and I weren't friends. We weren't close. We'd never had a real conversation beyond superficial small talk at Christmas dinner 2 years ago and my father's birthday barbecue last summer. We had no relationship, no reason to be in communication, especially not at 11:34 on a Thursday night with urgent messages about checking email. My first thought, the one that made my heart start racing before I'd even opened my email app, was that something had happened to my father. A car accident on his way home from work, a sudden heart attack, something catastrophic and immediate that would require notification through whatever channels were available. I opened my email app with hands that were already starting to shake, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. That anticipatory dread that comes in the seconds before bad news when you know your life is about to change, but don't yet understand how or how badly. The most recent email sat at the top of my inbox, sent just 14 minutes earlier from my stepmother Claire's personal Gmail account. The subject line read, "Some things needed to go," with that particular emoji that immediately felt wrong, discordant, inappropriate, like someone smiling at a funeral or laughing at a memorial service. I opened it with a sense of wrongness already crawling up my spine. The email body contained no text at all, no explanation or context, just a video file attachment labeled springcleaning.mp4 and 12 image attachments with generic camera-generated names like IMG4847 through IMG4858. Something about the casual labeling, the cheerful subject line, the incongruous emoji, made my hands shake harder as I tapped to download the video file, waiting the eternal seconds it took to load on my apartment's mediocre Wi-Fi connection, and then pressed play. The video was shaky, clearly shot on a smartphone by someone who wasn't concerned with cinematography or stability or framing, just documentation. It opened with Claire's face filling the screen in an extreme close-up, so close I could see her pores and the individual eyelashes of her carefully applied mascara. She was smiling in a way I'd never seen before, an expression that wasn't happiness exactly, but something closer to manic excitement, triumph. vindication. She was wearing the expensive black athleisure set my father had bought her for Christmas, the one that cost $200 and that she'd posted about extensively on Instagram. Her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a high ponytail, her makeup flawless, even though it was apparently late evening, based on the darkness visible in the background behind her. "Hi, Meredith," she said, and there was something in the way she said my name, a particular emphasis or inflection that felt mocking, condescending, like she was talking to a child who needed to be taught a lesson. "I know you and your dad have been talking about me behind my back. I know you've been filling his head with poison about me, telling him I don't belong in this family, that I'm not good enough to replace your perfect dead mother. Well, I have something to show you. Something I think you need to see." The camera swung away from her face in a wild arc that made me slightly nauseous, the image blurring and spinning before stabilizing to show a view I recognized instantly despite the darkness and the poor lighting. The backyard of my childhood home in Dallas, the house my parents had bought when I was 3 years old, the house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway and hosted birthday parties in this exact backyard and taken prom photos on the front porch with my date and my parents. The house my mother had died in 4 years ago after a brutal, degrading, impossibly hard 9-month battle with ovarian cancer that had reduced her from a vibrant woman who taught second grade and volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday and grew tomatoes in the garden to a skeletal, pain-racked presence in a hospital bed that had been set up in what used to be our dining room. The video showed the backyard illuminated by the back porch light and what looked like several portable work lights that had been set up specifically for this purpose, arranged in a circle to provide maximum visibility. In the center of the yard, clearly visible and unmistakable, was the large metal fire pit we'd used occasionally when I was younger for s'mores and marshmallow roasting on summer evenings. But now it wasn't set up for a cozy family gathering. Now it was filled with items I recognized instantly, even in the poor lighting and shaky video quality, items that made my breath catch in my throat and my vision narrow to a tunnel. My mother's wedding dress, the ivory satin gown with delicate lace sleeves and seed pearl detailing that she'd worn in the photographs I'd studied 1,000 times. The dress she'd had professionally preserved in an archival box after the wedding. The dress she'd saved with the vague idea that maybe I'd want to wear it, or at least incorporate parts of it into my own wedding dress someday, was draped over the edge of the fire pit, the fabric already darkened with soot and starting to curl at the edges, where flames were licking up from below. The antique mahogany jewelry box her grandmother had left her, the one with the tiny drawers and secret compartments, sat nearby on the ground with its lid open, its contents apparently already added to whatever was burning in the pit. I could see the corner of a photo album, one of at least 15 that documented my entire childhood in chronological order. Every birthday and Christmas and first day of school and summer vacation, carefully preserved with my mother's captions written in silver pen in her distinctive handwriting. "Your dad is in Chicago for work," Claire's voice continued from behind the camera, slightly breathless with excitement or exertion. "He'll be gone for 4 whole days at that engineering conference. That gives me plenty of time to finally clean out all this junk that's been taking up valuable space in our house. Not his and hers. Not a shrine to a dead woman. Our house. Mine and his. And I'm tired, so tired, of living in a museum of the past, of feeling like a guest in my own home, because every room has some reminder of precious perfect Catherine, who could do no wrong. Catherine. My mother's name was Catherine Marie Harrison before she married my father and became Catherine Harrison Beck, though everyone who loved her called her Kate or Katie. She'd died 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days ago. I knew the exact count, because for the first year I'd tracked it obsessively, marking each day survived without her. From ovarian cancer that had been diagnosed at stage 4, already metastasized to her liver and lungs, giving her less than a year from diagnosis to death, even with the aggressive chemotherapy that had made her so sick, so weak, so unlike herself, that sometimes I'd barely recognize the woman in the hospital bed as my vibrant, energetic mother. The camera zoomed in on the fire pit as Claire walked closer, and now I could see flames actively burning, could see smoke rising in thick gray columns, could see the distinctive way paper curls and blackens and disintegrates when exposed to fire. She was burning my mother's things, not accidentally, not carelessly, but deliberately, methodically, gleefully burning them while recording video evidence for my benefit. All those photo albums you're so obsessed with? Claire's voice took on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl, made nausea rise in my throat. The ones taking up an entire shelf in the garage, like some kind of sacred archive? They're junk, Meredith. Complete junk. Nobody looks at physical photos anymore. Everything's digital now. It's time to update, to move into the 21st century instead of wallowing in the past. The camera focused on her hand as she bent down and picked up one of the albums. I could see it clearly now, could recognize the cover as the one from my 10th birthday party. The one with photos of my mother and me making my birthday cake together in the kitchen, flour on both our faces, laughing at something I could no longer remember. Claire held it up to the camera for a moment, as if giving me time to recognize it and understand what was about to happen, and then tossed it into the fire pit, where it landed with a heavy thump and immediately began smoking as the flames caught the cover. "The wedding dress?" Claire continued, her voice dripping with disdain as she swung the camera to focus on the ivory satin that was now partially engulfed in flames, the delicate lace sleeves blackening and curling in on themselves. Who keeps a wedding dress for 40 years? Literally nobody. It's not like anyone was ever going to wear it. You certainly weren't going to wear it. You can't even keep a boyfriend for more than 3 months, let alone make it to an actual wedding. So into the fire it goes. One less thing cluttering up my closet space. The words hit like physical blows, but I couldn't stop watching, couldn't close the video or look away, even though every second felt like torture. The video continued for 6 more excruciating minutes. 6 eternal minutes, where Claire methodically fed item after item into the flames, while providing running commentary about what each thing was and why it was junk, or garbage, or clutter, that needed to be disposed of. The quilts my grandmother, my mother's mother, who died when I was 15, had made by hand, one for each significant milestone in my life. My birth, my baptism, my first communion, my 8th grade graduation, my high school graduation. 5 quilts that had taken her hundreds of hours each to create, with intricate patterns and hand-stitching and fabrics chosen specifically for their meaning or beauty. Old blankets that nobody uses anymore, Claire declared with a dismissive wave, shoving them into the flames where they smoldered and caught fire, the carefully stitched patterns disappearing into ash. The collection of antique teacups my mother had inherited from her grandmother, 23 delicate porcelain cups with different floral patterns that she'd displayed in the china cabinet in the dining room, each one carefully dusted and maintained. I watched as Claire picked them up one by one, held each up to the camera for a moment, and then threw them into the fire pit where they shattered from the impact and the heat. "Dust collectors," she pronounced with satisfaction. "We have plenty of regular mugs. Who needs fancy cups that can't even go in the dishwasher?" The letters my father had written to my mother during their courtship. He'd been in the army, stationed overseas, and she'd been finishing her teaching degree at university, and they'd written back and forth for 18 months before he'd returned and proposed. The letters had been tied with a faded blue ribbon and stored in a decorative wooden box my mother had painted herself. I'd read through them once, about a year after she died, sitting on the floor of the garage and crying as I read my father's young voice, telling my mother he loved her, describing his dreams for their future, asking her to wait for him. "Old love letters from before I even existed," Claire said with a laugh that sounded genuinely amused. "Why would we keep these? It's not like their ancient love story matters now that she's dead and gone." My mother's teaching materials, several large plastic storage bins full of lesson plans she'd developed over 23 years of teaching 2nd grade, student artwork she'd saved, letters from parents thanking her for her dedication and care, teaching awards from the school district recognizing her excellence and innovation, certificates from professional development courses and workshops. "She's been dead for 4 years, Claire said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact as she tipped one of the bins into the fire, pages and papers cascading into the flames. "She's not teaching anymore. She's not coming back. This is literal garbage taking up space in my garage. The video continued its horrific documentation. My mother's favorite cardigan, the soft blue one she'd worn constantly during her illness, because it was gentle on her sensitive skin. The framed photograph of my parents on their wedding day that had sat on my father's nightstand for 35 years. The set of pearl earrings my father had given my mother for their 25th anniversary. The garden journal, where she'd kept notes about what she planted each year and how things grew. The recipe box full of index cards in her handwriting with family recipes passed down through generations. The stack of children's books she'd collected to read to her future grandchildren. Each item received a brief description of why it was worthless, why it needed to be destroyed, why keeping it was unhealthy and pathological, and preventing the family from moving forward. And each item was then fed into the flames, while Claire watched and recorded, her commentary becoming more animated and excited as she went, like she was getting a rush from the destruction, like this was the most satisfying thing she'd done in years. When the video finally ended, after 6 minutes and 43 seconds, I could see the timestamp. I sat in stunned, horrified silence, my mind unable to fully process what I'd just witnessed. My hands were still shaking, now trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel, my breathing had become shallow and rapid, and there was a high-pitched ringing in my ears that might have been tinnitus, or might have been my nervous system overloading from the shock. Then, with hands that felt disconnected from my body, I opened the image attachments, 12 photographs, clearly taken after the fire had burned down to embers and ash, showing the aftermath of Claire's destruction in excruciating detail. Close-ups of the fire pit, filled with gray ash and twisted metal that had once been part of the jewelry box, broken ceramic shards that had been teacups, unidentifiable charred remains of what might have been books or fabric or papers. Wider shots showing the empty garage shelves where the storage bins had been, the vacant space almost obscene in its emptiness. And then the final image, the one that somehow hurt almost as much as the video itself. A selfie of Claire smiling triumphantly, with the smoking fire pit in the background, her face flushed from exertion or heat or satisfaction, her expression radiating pure vindictive joy. The caption below the photo, added in the image metadata, read simply, "Finally clean." I called my father immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to try 3 times before I could successfully tap his contact information. It went to voicemail. He was probably asleep in his Chicago hotel room, 3 hours ahead of Texas time, having gone to bed early after a long day of conference presentations and networking events. I tried again. Voicemail again. I tried a 3rd time, letting it ring through all 6 rings before his recorded message played. I tried a 4th time, and on the 5th attempt, he finally answered on the 6th ring, his voice thick with sleep and confusion and worry. "Meredith? What's wrong? What time is it? Are you okay? Are you hurt? What happened?" "Dad," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, high-pitched and distant like I was speaking from underwater or through a long tunnel. "Dad, you need to check your email right now, immediately. Claire sent me a video. Dad, she burned everything, all of Mom's things, everything we saved. The wedding dress, the photos, the quilts, the letters, her teaching stuff, everything. She burned it all and recorded herself doing it and sent it to me. You need to see this right now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I checked my phone screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. I could hear rustling sounds, the creak of a hotel bed, the soft tap of fingers on a phone screen. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath, a sound like someone had punched him hard in the solar plexus, forcing all the air from his lungs. "Oh my God!" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, rough and broken. "Oh my God, she didn't. She couldn't have. Meredith, those things were irreplaceable. They were your mother's. They were supposed to be yours someday. They weren't hers to touch, let alone to, oh God, the wedding dress, the photo albums, your grandmother's quilts. Oh God. Dad, are you okay?" I asked, genuinely frightened now because he sounded wrong, his breathing audible and labored through the phone connection, rapid and shallow in a way that sounded dangerous. I need to call you back, he said abruptly, his words coming out strained. I can't. I can't breathe right. Something's wrong. My chest feels tight. I need to. I'll call you back, Mir, I promise. The line went dead before I could respond, before I could tell him not to hang up, before I could say anything at all. I tried calling back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail, like he'd turned his phone off entirely or let the battery die. I called 5 more times over the next 10 minutes, increasingly panicked with each failed attempt, each call going directly to that same recorded message asking me to leave a callback number. I texted him, Dad, please answer. I'm worried about you. Call me back as soon as you can. Are you okay? Should I call someone? No response. The message showed as delivered, but not read. I texted again, Dad, I'm really scared. Please just text me back that you're okay. Even just one word, please. Still nothing. I was just Googling hotels near McCormick Place, Chicago, and trying to figure out which hotel he was likely staying at, so I could call the front desk when my phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number with a 312 area code. The message read, This is Dr. Sarah Kim from Northwestern Memorial Hospital Emergency Department in Chicago. I'm texting from your father's phone, which he had with him when he was brought in. Richard Beck was transported to our ED approximately 20 minutes ago after being found in distress by hotel staff. He's currently being evaluated for what appears to be a cardiac event. He's stable and conscious at this time. He asked me to contact you and let you know what's happening. You can call this number if you have questions. My hands went numb. The room tilted. I had to read the message 3 times before the words made sense, before my brain could connect cardiac event to heart attack to my father might die. I called immediately, was connected to Dr. Kim, listened as she explained in clear, professional, probably deliberately calm tones that my father had apparently left his hotel room shortly after our phone call, had tried to get to the elevator, had collapsed in the hallway where another hotel guest had found him, and immediately called hotel security, who had called 911. The paramedics had arrived within 6 minutes. He'd been conscious but in significant distress, complaining of chest pain and difficulty breathing, and what he described as crushing pressure in his chest. They were running tests, EKG, blood work, cardiac enzymes. It looked like a heart attack, though they needed confirmation and more detailed imaging to determine severity and treatment approach. He was in stable condition, receiving oxygen and medication, being monitored closely in the emergency department while they determined whether he needed immediate intervention. Did something happen to cause this? Dr. Kim asked, her voice professional, but with an undercurrent of curiosity that suggested she'd heard some version of events from the paramedics, or my father himself. The paramedics noted in their report that he was extremely agitated when they arrived, talking about his wife and something being burned. They weren't sure if he was confused or disoriented, or if something had actually occurred. His current wife destroyed belongings that belonged to his late first wife, I said, forcing the words out past the tightness in my throat, trying to keep my voice steady and factual, because I needed this doctor to take this seriously, to understand cause and effect. Irreplaceable items, wedding dress, family photos, heirlooms. She burned them deliberately and recorded it and sent me video of her doing it. My father found out about it maybe 20 minutes before the symptoms started. The emotional shock and stress probably triggered the heart attack. I see, Dr. Kim said, and I could hear in her tone that she was making connections, understanding the timeline, recognizing acute emotional trauma as a cardiac trigger. That would certainly qualify as sufficient psychological stress to precipitate a cardiac event in someone with underlying risk factors. Is there any way you can get to Chicago? I think it would be beneficial for your father to have family present, and there will be treatment decisions to make depending on what the tests show. I was on a flight to Chicago 5 hours later. I called out of work at 6 in the morning, leaving a voicemail for my supervisor explaining there was a family emergency and I needed to be out indefinitely. I threw clothes randomly into a suitcase without really looking at what I was packing, grabbed my laptop and chargers, wrote a hasty note for my roommate asking her to feed my cat and water my plants. I booked the earliest flight I could find to Chicago, A 9:15 a.m. departure that cost $473 that I couldn't really afford, maxing out the one credit card I had that wasn't already at its limit. The 2-hour flight felt interminable. I sat in a middle seat between a businessman who typed aggressively on his laptop the entire time, and a teenager who listened to music so loud I could hear it through her headphones. I stared at the seat in front of me, my mind cycling through the same terrible thoughts, on repeat. What if he dies? What if the heart attack is severe and he doesn't make it? What if the last real conversation we had was about Claire's cruelty? What if I'd somehow caused this by calling him, by making him watch that video, by forcing him to confront what she'd done? I alternated between fury at Claire, white-hot rage that made my hands clench into fists and my jaw ache from clenching, and terror about my father's condition, and soul-crushing grief about my mother's belongings being destroyed, and bitter, useless guilt about not having protected them better, about not anticipating this possibility, about not moving everything somewhere safer years ago when Claire first started making comments about all this old stuff taking up space. The guilt was particularly toxic because part of me had known, hadn't I? I'd seen warning signs. I'd noticed how Claire would accidentally knock over framed photos of my mother and take days to put them back up. How she'd suggest donating my mother's clothes to help people who need them, as if that was generous rather than erasure. How she'd rearranged furniture to block the bookshelf where my mother's favorite novels were displayed. How she'd changed the subject whenever anyone mentioned my mother's name, or made subtle comments about living in the past, and moving forward, and building new memories. I'd seen all of it, and I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that I was being unfair to Claire, that grief was making me hypersensitive and reading malice into innocent actions. I'd told myself that, of course, Claire felt uncomfortable with constant reminders of my father's first wife, that it was probably hard for her, that I should be more understanding. I'd convinced myself that she wouldn't actually do anything destructive, that the passive-aggressive comments and subtle erasure were as far as it would go. I'd been catastrophically wrong. When I finally arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital and found my way to the cardiac intensive care unit on the 7th floor, it was just past 1 in the afternoon. My father was in a private room, looking smaller and older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him in my entire life. He was 58 years old, but looked 75 lying in that hospital bed with monitors beeping steadily, multiple IV lines in his arms, an oxygen cannula in his nose, that terrible pale blue hospital gown that makes everyone look diminished and vulnerable. His eyes were closed when I walked in, and for one horrible moment I thought I was too late, that he'd died while I was in transit. But then his eyes opened at the sound of the door, and when he saw me standing there in yesterday's clothes with my hastily packed suitcase, his face crumpled and he started crying, actual tears running down his face, which I'd only seen him do once before, at my mother's funeral 4 years ago. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying, his voice hoarse and broken. "Meredith, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should have known what kind of person she was. I should have seen it. I should have protected your mother's things better. I should have put them somewhere she couldn't access them. This is entirely my fault." "Dad, no," I said, moving quickly to his bedside and taking his hand carefully, mindful of the IV line taped to the back of it. "This is not your fault. You didn't do this. You didn't burn anything. Claire did this. This is completely her responsibility, her choice, her cruelty. You can't blame yourself for not predicting that someone would do something this deliberately terrible." "The doctor says I had a heart attack," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion and shock, like he was still processing the information himself. Not just stress or a panic attack or anxiety, an actual myocardial infarction, caused by acute emotional distress on top of plaque buildup in my arteries that I didn't even know I had. They did an emergency cardiac catheterization this morning. They found 2 significant blockages. They're talking about placing stents, about medications I'll need to take for the rest of my life, about cardiac rehabilitation and lifestyle changes, and how another major stress event could be fatal. The word fatal hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. "Then we eliminate the stress," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt, trying to project strength because one of us needed to be strong, and he clearly couldn't be right now. We deal with Claire. We make sure you recover. We figure this out together. You're going to be okay, Dad. You have to be okay. I want a divorce, my father said simply, his voice suddenly clearer and more certain than it had been moments before. I've been lying here for the last 6 hours thinking about nothing else, and I want a divorce from Claire. I want her out of the house. I want her out of my life completely and permanently. I want to never see her face or hear her voice or have to be in the same room with her ever again. What she did is unforgivable. What she did nearly killed me. The doctor was very clear about that. Said if the hotel guest hadn't found me when he did, if I'd been alone in my room, I might not have survived. What she did destroyed irreplaceable pieces of your mother's legacy, your inheritance, our family history. There's no coming back from that. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes or how ugly it gets. I want her completely gone from our lives. We spent 3 days in Chicago while my father underwent additional testing, received 2 stents to open the blocked arteries, and began what the doctors called the initial acute phase of cardiac rehabilitation. During those 3 days, while I slept in an uncomfortable chair that partially reclined in my father's hospital room and ate terrible cafeteria food and learned more about heart attacks and cardiac care than I'd ever wanted to know, Claire called my father's phone constantly. I'd taken control of his phone to prevent any additional stress, to act as a buffer between him and anything that might spike his blood pressure or cause more emotional turmoil. I watched her name appear on the screen over and over and over. 47 calls over 3 days. I let every single one go to voicemail, and I listened to each voicemail she left, documenting them, taking notes, saving them all because some instinct told me we'd need evidence of her behavior. The voicemails cycled through predictable stages, a textbook progression through manipulation tactics. First came confusion. "Richard, it's me. Where are you? Why aren't you answering? I've been calling since yesterday. Did something happen at the conference? Are you okay? I'm starting to get worried. Please just call me back and let me know you're safe." Then, concern that felt performative rather than genuine. "Okay, it's been 2 days now, and you're still not answering, and I'm really worried. This isn't like you. I called the conference hotel, and they said you checked out early. Where are you? What's going on? I'm imagining all kinds of terrible things. Please just respond. I don't even care if you're mad about the cleaning. I just need to know you're alive." Then frustration. "This is getting ridiculous, Richard. We're supposed to be partners. We're supposed to communicate. Whatever you're upset about, the silent treatment is not how adults handle problems. We need to talk about this like mature people. Call me back." Then anger. "Fine, don't call me back. See if I care. I was doing you a favor anyway, getting rid of all that depressing clutter. You should be thanking me for finally helping you move on from your dead wife instead of punishing me with silence like a child." Then self-pity. "I can't believe you're treating me this way after everything I've sacrificed to be part of this family. I gave up my apartment, my independence, my whole life to marry you and move into that house full of ghosts. I've tried so hard to make you happy, to be a good wife, to fit into your life. And this is how you repay me? By ignoring me? By choosing your dead wife over your living one?" Then blame and triangulation. "I know this is Meredith's fault. She's always hated me. She's never given me a chance. She's been poisoning you against me since the day we met, filling your head with lies, making you think I'm some kind of villain. She can't stand that you found happiness again, that you moved on. She wants you to be miserable forever, so she doesn't have to share you. Well, congratulations, Meredith. You're winning. Are you happy now?" Then threats. "If you don't call me back by tomorrow morning, I'm going to assume you want a divorce, and I'm going to start protecting my interests. I've already talked to a lawyer about what I'm entitled to after 3 years of marriage. I know my rights. That house is half mine. I'm entitled to spousal support. You can't just throw me away like garbage because your daughter doesn't like me." I documented every single message meticulously. I transcribed them word for word in a notes app on my phone. I saved the audio files to cloud storage. I took screenshots showing the call times and frequencies. The hospital social worker who'd been assigned to my father's case had recommended documenting everything for potential legal proceedings, and I was following her advice with almost obsessive thoroughness. On the fourth day, when my father was stable enough to be discharged from the hospital, though still weak and exhausted and moving carefully like everything hurt, we flew back to Dallas together. But we didn't go to the house he shared with Claire on Mercer Island, the house where I'd grown up, where my mother had died, where all her belongings had been stored until Claire destroyed them. Instead, we went to stay temporarily with my father's colleague Tom and his wife Rachel, who'd offered their guest room immediately when they heard what happened, who asked no questions and made no judgments and just provided safe space. I'd already been in contact with a family law attorney before we left Chicago. My father's colleague had recommended a woman named Margaret Huang, who specialized in high-conflict divorces, who had specific experience with cases involving emotional abuse and property destruction. I'd called her from the hospital, explained the situation, sent her the video and photos Claire had provided as evidence of her own cruelty, sent her my father's medical records from the hospitalization showing the direct connection between Claire's actions and his cardiac event. Margaret had listened to everything, asked pointed questions about timeline and witnesses and documentation, and said something that gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt since receiving that Instagram message. This is one of the clearest cases of intentional infliction of emotional distress I've seen in 20 years of practice. We have video evidence of the destruction. We have her own words describing what she did and why. We have immediate medical consequences that were foreseeable results of her actions. We can move very quickly on this. She filed divorce papers within 48 hours of our return to Dallas. Along with the divorce petition, she filed a restraining order preventing Claire from contacting my father directly or coming within 500 feet of him, and an emergency motion for exclusive occupancy of the marital home based on medical necessity. The argument being that my father needed a stable, low-stress environment to recover from his heart attack, and Claire's presence would be medically contraindicated given that she'd directly caused the cardiac event. Claire was served with the papers on a Tuesday afternoon while my father was at his first follow-up cardiology appointment, and I was at the house with 2 police officers as escort, gathering his essential belongings, clothes, medications, important documents, and some items from my old bedroom that I wanted to ensure Claire didn't destroy in retaliation. The process server reported back to Margaret that Claire had screamed, had thrown the papers on the ground, had called my father and me both a string of profanities, had threatened to destroy him in the divorce and take everything he has, and had slammed the front door so hard it cracked the wooden frame and knocked a picture off the hallway wall. What followed was 8 of the longest, most exhausting, most emotionally draining months of my life. Claire hired an attorney named Bradley Winters, who apparently specialized in maximizing divorce settlements for lower-earning spouses, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and theatrical courtroom presentations. Together, Claire and Bradley fought everything. They contested the restraining order, claiming in court filings that Claire was the real victim of a man who refused to let go of his deceased wife and move forward with his new marriage. They argued that the restraining order was punitive rather than protective, and that Claire posed no threat to my father. Judge Morrison, the family court judge assigned to our case, was not convinced by these arguments. He maintained the restraining order and extended its duration. They fought over the house, claiming it should be sold and the proceeds divided equally because Claire had maintained it and improved it during their 3-year marriage, despite the fact that my father had owned it free and clear for 35 years before meeting Claire, had bought it with my mother, had paid off the mortgage years ago. Bradley filed extensive documentation about minor improvements Claire claimed to have made. New curtains in the living room that cost $300, a repainted accent wall in the bedroom, new drawer organizers in the kitchen. Margaret countered with documentation showing the house's entire purchase history, mortgage payment records spanning decades, and the fact that Claire had been unemployed when she met my father and had contributed no income to household expenses during the marriage. They claimed Claire deserved substantial alimony for at least 5 years because she'd given up career opportunities and earning potential to be my father's wife and manage his household, despite the fact that she'd been working part-time retail when they met and had shown no evidence of any career she'd actually sacrificed. Bradley produced a vocational expert who testified that Claire's potential earning capacity had been diminished by her time out of the workforce. Margaret produced Claire's employment history, showing sporadic, low-wage jobs with frequent terminations and no evidence of career trajectory or professional development. Most horrifyingly, most infuriatingly, they claimed that the destruction of my mother's belongings was reasonable household management and helping the family move forward from unhealthy attachment to the past. Bradley actually argued in written court filings that my father's and my obsessive preservation of my mother's belongings was preventing healthy adjustment to Mr. Beck's new marriage, and that Claire's actions, while perhaps not ideally communicated, were motivated by legitimate concerns about her husband's psychological health and the family's ability to move forward. They characterized the video Claire had sent me as poor judgment in communication style, rather than deliberate cruelty. They claimed Claire had immediately regretted sending it. They argued that my father's heart attack was caused by pre-existing cardiac conditions rather than emotional stress, despite clear medical documentation of the timeline. The legal battle consumed my life for those 8 months. I flew back and forth between Austin and Dallas a dozen times for depositions, court hearings, mediation sessions that went nowhere. I spent hours with Margaret going through documents, preparing testimony, strategizing responses to Bradley's increasingly wild claims. I took unpaid leave from my job when I'd exhausted my limited paid time off. I maxed out my credit cards, paying for flights and hotels. I lost 15 pounds from stress and irregular eating. I barely slept. But Margaret was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely committed to holding Claire accountable. She documented everything. She deposed Claire for 7 hours, getting her to admit under oath that she'd destroyed the items deliberately, that she'd known they were precious to my father and me, that she'd sent me the video specifically to hurt me. She brought in medical experts who testified about emotional stress as a cardiac trigger. She presented the video evidence to the judge, making him watch Claire's gleeful destruction and mocking commentary. Judge Harold Morrison, a man in his mid-60s who'd been on the family court bench for 30 years and who'd apparently seen every manipulation tactic in existence, was clearly not impressed by Claire's arguments or Bradley's theatrical presentations. At one hearing, when Bradley was arguing that Claire had been trying to help by destroying my mother's belongings, Judge Morrison interrupted him. "Counsel," the judge said, his voice dry and skeptical, "are you seriously arguing that secretly burning your spouse's deceased first wife's possessions while he's out of town, recording yourself doing it, and sending the video to his daughter with mocking commentary constitutes help? Because that's not what help looks like in any definition I'm familiar with." The final divorce decree, issued 8 months and 21 days after Margaret filed the initial petition, was decisive and comprehensive. Claire received essentially nothing from the marital assets except what she'd brought into the marriage, which amounted to some used furniture from her previous apartment, her personal clothing and effects, and a 7-year-old Honda Civic. The house remained entirely my father's property. She received no alimony. She was ordered to vacate the marital home within 30 days and could only take her personal belongings, with any disputed items to be evaluated by a neutral third party that Margaret would select. She was ordered to pay her own legal fees, which Margaret estimated had probably cost her close to $30,000 that she'd had to borrow. The restraining order was extended for an additional 2 years, and most importantly to me, most satisfyingly, Judge Morrison included a specific written finding in the final divorce decree, in clear, unambiguous legal language that would become part of permanent court records. The judge wrote that Claire's destruction of my father's deceased wife's property constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress and extreme cruelty, that her actions showed reckless disregard for the emotional and physical well-being of her spouse, and that her behavior directly contributed to Mr. Beck's cardiac emergency and ongoing health issues. That finding mattered. It meant there was an official, legal, permanent record of what Claire had done, documented in court records that anyone could access. It wasn't just our word against hers, wasn't just family drama or he said she said. It was adjudicated fact, determined by a judge after reviewing all the evidence, that Claire had been deliberately cruel and had caused serious harm. By the time the divorce was finalized, my father had moved into a new apartment, a 2-bedroom ground floor unit in a building with an elevator and no stairs, selected specifically because stairs were dangerous for someone with his cardiac condition. He'd returned to work, but only part-time, with medical accommodations that allowed him to work from home 2 days a week and limited his hours. He'd been attending cardiac rehabilitation faithfully twice a week, slowly rebuilding his strength and stamina. He'd lost 42 pounds through the combined effects of stress, medication adjustments, and permanent dietary changes. He looked different, older, thinner, more careful in his movements, quick to tire. But he was alive and healing and moving forward with his life. The cardiologist had been clear. My father would never be exactly the same as he'd been before the heart attack. There was permanent damage to his heart muscle. He'd be on multiple medications for the rest of his life. He'd have activity restrictions and would need to avoid stress triggers. Another cardiac event could be fatal, but he'd survived. Against odds that had seemed frighteningly uncertain during those first hours in the Chicago emergency room, he'd survived. He was here, alive, present, able to rebuild his life, even if that life looked different than it had before. What we didn't have, what we could never have again, were the physical objects Claire had destroyed. That loss remained, would always remain, a permanent hole in our family history. My mother's wedding dress that I'd always imagined maybe incorporating into my own wedding dress someday, or at least keeping as a tangible link to their 32-year marriage. Her jewelry, including pieces that had been passed down from her grandmother and were supposed to come to me. The 5 quilts that represented hundreds of hours of my grandmother's handiwork, each stitch holding love and intention. The 15 photo albums spanning my entire childhood with my mother's handwritten captions in silver pen. Her teaching materials from 23 years of inspiring second graders and making them love learning. The love letters chronicling my parents' early relationship when they were young and in love and building their future together. All of it gone, reduced to ash, dumped in a garbage bin, hauled away to a landfill, irretrievable and irreplaceable forever. I struggled with this loss in ways I hadn't fully anticipated or prepared for. I thought I'd done my grieving when my mother died 4 years earlier. I thought I'd processed that loss as much as anyone ever fully processes losing a parent to cancer at 22 years old, watching them deteriorate and suffer and eventually die, despite everything doctors tried to do. I thought I'd learned to carry that grief, to integrate it into my life, to build an existence around the hole her absence left. But having her belongings destroyed felt like losing her again in a completely different way. A fresh wound carved into tissue that had never fully healed from the first injury. It was a new grief layered on top of old grief, and I wasn't prepared for how much it hurt, how the pain felt both familiar and entirely new. I started seeing a therapist, not just someone I talked to occasionally when things got particularly hard, but regular weekly appointments with a psychologist who specialized in complicated grief and family trauma. His name was Dr. James Martinez, and he was in his early 50s with kind eyes and a calm, steady presence that made it easier to talk about difficult things without feeling judged or rushed. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a legitimate, recognized, well-documented form of loss that had its own name in the psychological literature: ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. He explained that objects aren't just objects when they're connected to people we've loved and lost, that they serve important psychological functions that go far beyond their material value. Physical objects are anchors to memory, Dr. Martinez explained in one of our early sessions, speaking in that particular way therapists have, where they're giving you information while also validating your experience. They're tangible connections to people who are no longer physically present with us. They're confirmation that our memories are real, that the person existed, that the relationship mattered. When someone destroys those objects, especially deliberately and maliciously, it creates a particular kind of trauma that sits on top of the original loss. He drew a diagram showing how different types of loss interact and compound each other. You lost your mother to cancer. That's primary loss. Death loss, what we call clean grief, even though there's nothing clean about watching someone you love die slowly. Then you lost your mother's belongings to deliberate destruction. That's secondary loss, ambiguous loss, disenfranchised grief, because society doesn't always recognize property loss as legitimate. But for you, those objects weren't just property. They were the last physical evidence of your mother's existence, the last things you could touch that she'd touched. Losing them is losing her again in a different way. Is it normal that it hurts this much? I asked, crying in his office for probably the 10th time in as many sessions. Is it normal that sometimes I feel like I'm grieving my mother's death all over again, even though she died 4 years ago? Completely normal, Dr. Martinez said with conviction. You're not being dramatic or overly sensitive or wallowing. You experienced a real loss, multiple real losses actually. Your mother's death, your mother's belongings, your sense of safety in your own family, your trust in your father's judgment, your belief that some things were sacred and protected. All of those are legitimate losses that deserve to be grieved. My father started seeing Dr. Martinez too, first individually, and then eventually in joint sessions with me, where we'd sit on his comfortable gray couch and talk about what had been lost, and what Claire had done, and how to move forward when something crucial had been taken from you without your consent. We talked about anger, how to feel it fully, without letting it consume you, how to express it productively rather than destructively, how to direct it at the person who'd actually caused harm rather than turning it inward or spreading it to everyone around you. We talked about guilt and self-blame and the difference between responsibility and fault. We talked about what forgiveness means and whether it was even necessary or appropriate or healthy in a situation like this. Forgiveness is not always the goal, Dr. Martinez told us repeatedly, countering decades of cultural and religious messaging that insisted forgiveness was essential for healing and moving forward. Sometimes forgiveness is appropriate. When someone who's harmed you acknowledges that harm genuinely, shows real remorse, makes concrete efforts to repair what they've broken, and changes their behavior going forward. But when none of those things happen, when someone refuses to acknowledge harm, or minimizes it, or justifies it, or shows no capacity for empathy or change, forgiveness isn't healing. It's just premature closure. It's letting them off the hook for something they should absolutely be held accountable for. What about the saying that forgiveness is for you, not for them? I asked. That holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die? That's a nice aphorism, Dr. Martinez said, but it's not actually how anger or forgiveness work psychologically. Anger is information. It tells you that a boundary was violated, that harm was done, that something was wrong. Feeling that anger fully and appropriately is healthy. What's unhealthy is ruminating endlessly on the anger without ever processing it or directing it inappropriately at people who didn't cause it. But feeling justified anger at someone who caused you real harm? That's not poison. That's emotional honesty. So what is the goal, if not forgiveness? My father asked during one of our joint sessions, about 6 months into therapy, when he was physically stronger but still emotionally raw, still processing everything that had happened. Integration, Dr. Martinez said. The goal is integration, finding a way to carry what happened without it destroying you, to incorporate this experience into your life story without letting it become the only story, to build a future that honestly acknowledges the past without being imprisoned by it. You don't have to forgive Claire. You don't have to understand her, or make peace with her, or wish her well. You just have to find a way to live with what she did, to let it be part of your history without letting it control your present or determine your future. About 14 months after Claire's burning, following a year of intensive therapy and difficult emotional work, my father and I decided to do something Dr. Martinez had been gently suggesting for several months. We created a memory book dedicated to my mother, using what fragments we could salvage and reconstruct from the wreckage. We didn't have the physical photo albums Claire had burned, but we had some digital copies I'd saved years ago when I'd first gotten a scanner and had digitized a few dozen of my favorite photos, thinking vaguely about making a digital backup someday, but never finishing the project. We had photos my Aunt Karen had kept from family gatherings. We had some my mother's teaching colleagues had saved from school events. We had a few that had been posted on social media by various family members over the years. But more importantly, we had stories. We had memories. We had the intangible legacy that no fire could burn. I reached out to everyone I could think of who'd known my mother, casting a wide net through social media and email and phone calls. Her former teaching colleagues who'd worked alongside her for over 2 decades. Her college friends who'd scattered across the country, but still remembered her fondly. Extended family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, my mother's surviving brother who lived in Oregon, the friends she'd made through book club, and the animal shelter where she'd volunteered, and the community garden where she'd grown those tomatoes. Most importantly, I reached out to her former students. I found a Facebook group for alumni of Lincoln Elementary, where my mother had taught, and I posted a request. My mother was Catherine Beck, Mrs. Beck, who taught 2nd grade at Lincoln from 1989 to 2012. She passed away 4 years ago. I'm creating a memory book about her life and would love to include stories from anyone who remembers her or was impacted by her teaching. If you have any memories or photos you'd be willing to share, please contact me. The response was overwhelming in the most beautiful, unexpected way. Within a week, I'd received over 60 messages from former students, ranging in age from their mid-20s to late 30s, people who'd been in my mother's classroom anywhere from 5 to 23 years ago. They sent stories about how she'd helped them learn to read when they were struggling, how she'd noticed when they came to school, hungry, and quietly made sure they got breakfast, how she'd stayed late to help with homework when their parents couldn't, how she'd believed in them when no one else did. One message came from a woman named Jessica Williams, who was now a teacher herself, working in a low-income district in Houston. She wrote a 3-page email about how my mother had helped her through her parents' bitter divorce when she was 7 years old, how my mother had recognized she was struggling and had created a safe space in the classroom where Jessica could go when things felt overwhelming, how my mother had taught her that she wasn't responsible for adult problems and that she deserved to be a kid even when everything at home was chaos. I became a teacher because of your mom, Jessica wrote. She showed me what education could be when it was done with genuine care and high expectations. She saved my life, literally saved it, because I was in a very dark place that year, and she gave me a reason to keep going to school, keep trying, keep believing things could get better. I think about her all the time when I'm working with my own struggling students. I try to be for them what she was for me. Her influence ripples through every kid I teach. Another message came from a man named Marcus Chen, who was now a principal at a middle school in San Antonio. He wrote about how my mother had been the first teacher who'd ever asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and had taken his answer. I want to work with kids. Seriously, instead of laughing or telling him to aim higher or be more ambitious. She told me that working with children was the most important work anyone could do, Marcus wrote. She said teachers are the foundation of everything else because we create all the other professionals. The doctors and lawyers and engineers and artists all had teachers who helped them get there. She made me proud to want to go into education instead of ashamed of it. That one conversation changed my entire life trajectory. I went to college specifically to become a teacher, and now I'm a principal trying to create schools where every kid feels seen and valued. That's your mom's legacy, continuing through me and through the hundreds of teachers I mentor and the thousands of students who pass through our building. Story after story, impact after impact, ripples spreading out from one person's dedication and care into dozens of lives, then spreading from those dozens into hundreds more, then from hundreds into thousands. The mathematics of teaching: one teacher might work with roughly 100 to 120 students per year, and over a 23-year career, that's approximately 2,700 students directly taught. And those students grow up to teach their own children, influence their own communities, become teachers themselves who teach thousands more. I compiled everything into a large leather-bound book with high-quality paper and proper binding that would last. I organized it chronologically, starting with stories about my mother's childhood that my aunt had contributed, moving through her college years and early teaching career, her marriage to my father, my birth and childhood, her mature teaching years when she'd really hit her stride professionally, her illness and death, and finally the aftermath, the impact she'd left behind, the students who'd become teachers, the lives still being changed by her influence years after her death. I included the digital photos we'd salvaged, printed on archival quality photo paper. I included handwritten letters that people had sent, carefully scanned so the original handwriting was preserved. I included teaching evaluations and student thank you notes that her colleagues had saved copies of. I included newspaper clippings about awards she'd won. I included a copy of her college transcript showing her education degree. I included the program from her memorial service. I included everything I could gather that proved my mother had existed, had mattered, had touched lives in ways that continued reverberating. My father created his own version, approaching the project differently, based on his own needs and memories and grieving process. He wrote long, detailed entries about their courtship and wedding and early years of marriage. He wrote about the struggles they'd faced together, the financial stress of their 20s when they were both starting careers and barely making ends meet, the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages before I was finally born, the normal challenges of maintaining a partnership over 3 decades, the way they'd learned to fight fairly and forgive quickly and choose each other every day. He included practical things too, details that might otherwise be lost. Her recipes, which he wrote out from memory since the originals had burned, trying to recreate the exact way she made her famous spaghetti sauce and her chocolate chip cookies that everyone always requested at potlucks. He drew sketches of objects he remembered, her favorite coffee mug with the chipped handle that she refused to replace, the reading chair where she'd spent countless hours, the garden stones she'd painted with inspirational quotes that had lined the walkway to the front door. The memory books weren't replacements for what we'd lost. Nothing could truly replace my mother's actual wedding dress, or the quilts her mother had made, or the photo albums with her handwriting. But they were something. They were intentional preservation. They were active remembering instead of passive nostalgia. They were proof that even when someone tries to erase history, memory persists if people make the conscious choice to preserve it and share it. We also decided to start a scholarship fund in my mother's name for students studying elementary education, with a special focus on those planning to teach in underserved communities where my mother had spent the final decade of her career after transferring from a wealthy suburban district to an inner-city school that desperately needed experienced teachers. We funded it initially with some money from my father's divorce settlement. There was a certain poetic justice in using money that came indirectly from Claire's cruelty to create something that honored my mother's legacy. We also contributed our own money, and we invited contributions from anyone who wanted to participate. I set up a website with information about my mother and the scholarship criteria, sharing the link through social media and email. Within 6 months, we'd raised enough money to award our first scholarship, a full tuition award of $5,000 to a college student studying education, with preference given to those planning to teach in high-need schools. We established selection criteria that tried to honor what my mother had valued, demonstrated commitment to educational equity, understanding of the challenges facing underserved student populations, and clear passion for teaching as a tool for social change. The first scholarship recipient was a young man named Daniel Torres, a first-generation college student from a small town in South Texas, studying elementary education at Texas State University with plans to return to his hometown to teach. His application essay talked about growing up in a community where most teachers were white and middle class and didn't speak Spanish, even though most students were Latino and many came from Spanish-speaking homes. He wrote about wanting to be a teacher who reflected his students' identities, who understood their communities, who could bridge the gap between home culture and school culture. We held a small award ceremony at my father's apartment, inviting Daniel and his family, along with some of my mother's former colleagues and a few family members. My father was still too emotional to speak at length, So I gave brief remarks about my mother's commitment to educational equity and her belief that every child deserved a teacher who saw their potential and believed in their capacity to learn. Daniel gave a short speech that made everyone in the room cry. "I never met Mrs. Beck," he said, his voice strong and clear despite his obvious nervousness about public speaking. But reading about her life and her teaching philosophy for the scholarship application, I felt like I got to know her through her values and her impact. She believed that teaching was about more than just delivering curriculum. It was about seeing potential in every kid, believing in them even when they didn't believe in themselves, creating classrooms where students felt safe and valued and capable. That's the kind of teacher I want to be. That's what this scholarship helps me become. I'm going to carry Mrs. Beck's name forward into my classroom and try to honor her legacy through how I teach. I thought about Claire in that moment, standing in my father's modest apartment, watching this young man accept a scholarship in my mother's name, committing to carry forward her values into classrooms she'd never taught in, with students she'd never met, in communities she'd never visited. Claire had tried to erase my mother's impact by burning her possessions. But instead, we'd found ways to make her memory more public, more lasting, more deliberately amplified than it had been when it was just contained in boxes gathering dust in a garage. The scholarship became an annual tradition that gave us something to look forward to, a concrete way to honor my mother that felt active and forward-looking rather than just dwelling on loss. Each year we'd meet the recipient or recipients. Some years, we had enough donations to award 2 scholarships instead of just 1, and we'd hear their stories about why they wanted to teach, what they hoped to accomplish, what kind of difference they wanted to make. Over the next several years, we awarded 9 more scholarships. Each recipient wrote thank you letters sharing their teaching experiences, and many stayed in touch, sending updates about their careers and their students. Jessica Williams, that former student who'd contacted me initially, ended up joining our scholarship selection committee, bringing the perspective of someone who'd been taught by my mother and was now teaching herself. The scholarship recipients began forming their own community, connecting with each other through social media, supporting each other through the inevitable challenges of teaching, sharing resources and strategies and encouragement. Several of them mentioned in their updates that receiving the scholarship had been about more than just money. It had connected them to a legacy, made them part of a story larger than themselves, given them a community of people who believed in what they were trying to do. My own life continued moving forward in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark days when my father was in the hospital in Chicago, and I was flying back and forth and maxing out credit cards and wondering if we'd survive Claire's destruction. I met someone, a man named Tyler, who worked in software development, who I met at a friend's wedding about 2 years after Claire's burning. We dated for 18 months before I told him the full story about my mother's death and Claire's cruelty and the fire that had destroyed everything. I'd mentioned in general terms that my mother had died of cancer and that my father had remarried badly and then divorced, but I hadn't gone into the traumatic details. It felt too heavy, too complicated, too much to lay on someone in the early stages of a relationship. But when things got serious, when we started talking about moving in together and potentially building a future, I knew he needed to understand this piece of my history, this wound that had shaped me even as I was healing from it. So one evening in his apartment, with my hands shaking slightly and my voice not quite steady, I told him everything. The video, the hospital, the divorce, the loss. All of it. Tyler listened without interrupting, his face showing appropriate horror and sympathy, but not pity. Not that awful, "you poor thing" expression I'd gotten from some people who didn't know what to say and defaulted to treating me like a tragic figure. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, processing. I'm sorry that happened to you and your dad," he finally said. "Your mother deserved better. Your family deserved better. What Claire did was cruel, and there's no justifying it. But I have to say, and tell me if this is wrong to say, I'm impressed by what you built from it. The memory book, the scholarship fund, the way you've kept your mother's influence alive and spreading. That's remarkable. That takes strength." He paused, then added, "And it tells me something important about who you are. You could have responded to that cruelty with more cruelty, with revenge fantasies, with letting it make you bitter and closed off. Instead, you chose to build something meaningful. That's the kind of person I want in my life. We moved in together 6 months later. We got engaged a year after that. We married 3 years after Claire's burning, in a small ceremony where my father walked me down the aisle looking healthy and happy, where several of the scholarship recipients attended as guests, where I wore my grandmother's wedding veil, one of the few family heirlooms that had been spared, because it had been stored at my aunt's house rather than in our garage. My father, who I'd worried would never trust or open his heart again after Claire's betrayal, eventually started dating again about 2 years after his divorce was finalized. He met a woman named Susan at a cardiac support group the hospital ran for heart attack survivors. She was a widow herself. Her husband had died 3 years earlier from complications of diabetes, and she understood grief and loss in a way someone who hasn't experienced it simply cannot. Susan was different from Claire in every way that mattered. When my father mentioned my mother, Susan didn't stiffen or change the subject or make comments about living in the past. She asked questions. She wanted to know about my mother, about their relationship, about what kind of person she'd been. "She shaped who you are," Susan said to my father during one of the first conversations they had about my mother. "How can I know you without knowing something about her?" When Susan came to my father's apartment for the first time and saw that he still had photos of my mother displayed, not shrine-like or obsessive, just present, part of his home, she didn't ask him to remove them or show any discomfort. She just accepted it as normal, as a healthy acknowledgement that he'd had a life and a love before her. "My late husband's photos are all over my house too," Susan told me when we first met, when I was cautiously vetting her and trying to determine if she was safe for my father to be vulnerable with. Not because I'm stuck in the past or refusing to move forward, just because he was a huge part of my life for 26 years, and pretending he didn't exist would be dishonest and disrespectful to our history. If I'm going to be with your dad, I'm with all of him, including his history and his first marriage and his grief. That's not threatening to me. That's just reality. That's when I knew Susan was fundamentally different from Claire, that she was operating from a completely different psychological place. She had the emotional security to coexist with my mother's memory, to understand that my father's past wasn't a threat to his present, that love isn't a zero-sum game where caring about someone who died means there's less care available for someone who's alive. My father and Susan dated for 2 years, taking it slow, making sure it was right, not rushing into legal entanglements or major commitments. They eventually bought a small house together in a quiet neighborhood, combining their furniture and belongings and lives in a way that honored both of their pasts. Susan's photos of her late husband hung alongside my father's photos of my mother. Her adult children from her first marriage visited for holidays alongside me and Tyler. They built something new while making space for what had come before. On what would have been my mother's 60th birthday, about 5 years after Claire's burning, we held a memorial gathering. We invited everyone who'd known her, family, former teaching colleagues, parents of students she'd taught, the scholarship recipients, friends from various phases of her life. Nearly 70 people came to a community center we'd rented for the afternoon, bringing food and additional photos we hadn't seen before, and more stories we'd never heard. My father stood up to speak, healthier now than he'd been in years, having made permanent lifestyle changes and managed his cardiac condition well. "Someone tried to erase my wife from our lives 5 years ago," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Tried to destroy every physical reminder of her existence, tried to make us forget her, move on, stop talking about her, stop letting her be part of our family story. They failed. They failed completely, utterly, absolutely." He gestured around the room at all the people gathered. "Looking at all of you, I see proof that a person's impact doesn't end when they die. It continues through the people whose lives they touched, through the values they passed down, through the ripples they created that spread out in ways they never could have predicted or imagined. You're all here because Catherine Beck mattered to you, because she influenced your life in some way, because her kindness or teaching or friendship or example made a difference that you still remember years or even decades later. The person who tried to erase Catherine thought she was destroying my wife by burning her belongings, my father continued. But belongings aren't the person. Objects aren't impact. Possessions aren't legacy. Catherine's legacy is in this room, in the teachers she inspired who are teaching their own students, in the scholarship recipients carrying her name forward, in the children and grandchildren being raised with values she instilled, in memories being shared and stories being told. That legacy can't be burned. It can't be destroyed. It only grows and spreads and continues. I thought about Claire in that moment, where she was, what she was doing, whether she ever thought about what she'd done or felt any remorse. I'd heard through distant acquaintances that she'd moved to another state, had married and divorced again, continued her pattern of finding widowers and then becoming jealous of their late wives. But I didn't know for certain and didn't care enough to verify. She was irrelevant to our lives now, had been for years, just a person who'd caused harm once and then been removed from our lives, like a cancer that had been surgically excised. What mattered was this room full of people gathered to remember and celebrate someone Claire had tried to erase. What mattered was the 10 scholarship recipients who'd been supported so far, who were teaching hundreds of students, who were creating their own ripples. What mattered was that my mother's influence continued spreading, despite Claire's best efforts to stop it. I'm 34 years old now as I write this, sitting at my desk in the house Tyler and I bought together in suburban Austin, listening to our 2-year-old daughter, Emily Rose, playing with blocks in the living room while Tyler makes dinner in the kitchen. It's an ordinary Thursday evening in an ordinary life, which feels miraculous after everything we've been through. Emily is named after my mother. Catherine's middle name was Rose, and Emily was my grandmother's name, so our daughter carries both legacies forward. I tell her stories about the grandmother she'll never meet, show her pictures from the memory book, teach her about kindness and perseverance, and seeing potential in others. Grandma Kate was a teacher, Emily announced proudly a few weeks ago, having absorbed this fact from repeated tellings. She helped kids learn to read and be smart and feel happy at school. That's right, I confirmed. She believed every kid deserved a teacher who believed in them. When I grow up, I'm going to be a teacher too, Emily declared, with the certainty only a 2-year-old can have about future career plans that will undoubtedly change a dozen times. Just like Grandma Kate. Whether or not Emily actually becomes a teacher, the fact that she's growing up knowing her grandmother's values, hearing stories about her dedication and kindness, understanding that teaching is important work, that's legacy continuing forward. That's what Claire couldn't burn. My father is 66 now, retired from his engineering firm, but far from inactive. He volunteers as a reading tutor at a local elementary school 3 days a week, finding purpose in education work that honors my mother's memory while also being meaningful on its own terms. He and Susan travel regularly, not exotic international destinations that would require long flights and strenuous activities my father's heart couldn't handle, but road trips to national parks, visits to historical sites, weekends at bed and breakfasts. They live comfortably, happily, having built something good from the wreckage Claire left behind. The scholarship fund has now awarded 18 scholarships over 8 years. 18 teachers carrying my mother's name into their classrooms, working with thousands of students, creating exponential ripples of impact that spread further than we can track or measure. The memory book has grown to 5 volumes now, expanding as we discover new stories and photos and perspectives on my mother's life and influence. Claire's burning happened 8 years ago. My father's heart attack happened 8 years ago. The divorce was finalized 7 years ago. These events still shape our family's story. They're significant chapters that can't be erased or ignored. But they don't define us. They're part of the narrative, but not the whole story, not the ending, not even the climax. The whole story is about resilience and reconstruction. It's about choosing to honor someone's memory through action rather than just passive grief. It's about building community around shared values. It's about refusing to let cruel people's actions determine your family's future. It's about understanding that legacy lives in impact rather than in objects, in values rather than possessions, in ripples that spread outward rather than things that can be contained in boxes. If Claire could see what we've built from what she tried to destroy, I don't know what she'd feel. Remorse? Jealousy? Indifference? I genuinely don't know and don't spend much energy wondering. She made her choices. She lives with the consequences. Those consequences include being completely absent from our lives, having no access to the family she married into, missing out on everything good that's happened since she left. That's her loss, not ours. We moved forward. We healed. We built something meaningful. She's stuck wherever she is, apparently repeating the same patterns that led her to burn my mother's belongings, never learning or growing or changing. The last time I heard anything about Claire was about 2 years ago, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing her engagement announcement on Facebook to another widower. I felt a momentary impulse to reach out to this man somehow, to warn him, to tell him what Claire had done to our family. But I didn't. Adults make their own choices and live with their own consequences. I can't protect everyone from making mistakes. What I can do is continue the work of honoring my mother's memory and keeping her influence alive and spreading. Continue funding scholarships. Continue sharing stories. Continue teaching Emily about the grandmother she never met. Continue living according to the values my mother tried to instill in me. Kindness, integrity, dedication to making the world slightly better, refusing to let cruel people make you cruel in return. My mother died at 54 from ovarian cancer. Someone tried to erase her 4 years later by destroying all her physical belongings in a backyard fire while gleefully recording the destruction. That person failed completely, utterly, absolutely, because my mother wasn't her wedding dress, or her photo albums, or her quilts, or her jewelry, or her teaching materials, or any of the objects Claire burned. My mother was her influence, her values, her impact on hundreds of students over 23 years of teaching. She was the love she gave her family. She was the difference she made in individual lives. The struggling reader she taught to love books, the kid from a chaotic home she made feel safe, the future teacher she inspired to choose education as a career. Those things, those essential, important, meaningful things, survive. They persist. They grow. They spread. They influence people my mother never met and situations she never imagined. They compound over time like interest on the wisest possible investment. That's what Claire never understood, and apparently still doesn't. You cannot destroy legacy by burning objects. You cannot erase impact by destroying belongings. You cannot eliminate love by removing reminders. What truly matters survives every fire. What love creates outlasts any hate. What dedication builds continues growing long after the person who built it is gone. My mother has been dead for 12 years. Her belongings were burned 8 years ago. And yet, here I am, writing her story, preserving her memory, raising my daughter with her values, supporting a scholarship in her name, connecting with teachers she inspired, ensuring her influence continues spreading outward into a future she never got to see, but helped create through how she lived and taught and loved. That continuation, that persistence, that refusal to let destruction be the final word, that's the real story. Not Claire's cruelty, though that's part of it, but the larger story of how families survive attempts to erase their history, how communities form around shared values, how love persists despite hate's best efforts, how one dedicated second-grade teacher in Texas continues creating ripples decades later that touch lives in states she never visited and classrooms she never imagined. That's legacy. That's what survives. That's what matters more than any physical object ever could. And no fire, no matter how deliberately set, or how completely it burns, or how much someone enjoys watching it burn, can ever change that fundamental truth. Claire tried to erase my mother. She destroyed precious, irreplaceable objects. She caused real harm to real people. She nearly killed my father. She created trauma that we're still processing years later. But she failed at her ultimate goal. She failed to erase my mother's memory, or diminish her influence, or stop her legacy from continuing and growing. If anything, Claire's cruelty made us more intentional about preserving and sharing my mother's story, more committed to keeping her values alive, more dedicated to ensuring her impact continues spreading. We responded to destruction with creation. We responded to hate with love. We responded to erasure with deliberate, intentional, amplified remembering. And we're not done. As long as Emily and whatever other children we might have carry forward these stories, as long as the scholarship continues supporting teachers, as long as those 18 recipients teach thousands of students who teach their own students, as long as memory persists through conscious choice and intentional action, my mother's influence continues. That's victory, not dramatic or immediate or satisfying in the way revenge might be, but real, lasting, meaningful victory that compounds over time. Claire tried to burn away my mother. We responded by making her more present, more celebrated, more deliberately honored than she'd been before. We turned destruction into motivation for preservation. We transformed hate into commitment to love. We converted erasure into intentional legacy building. And that surviving, that persisting, that continuing to create and build and remember and honor, despite what someone tried to destroy, that's what it means to win against cruelty, not by being cruel back, but by refusing to let cruelty have the final word, by choosing, again and again, day after day, year after year, to build instead of burn, to remember instead of forget, to love instead of hate, to create instead of destroy, to honor instead of erase. That's the whole story. That's the whole truth. That's the whole victory. And it's enough.